Hi, I'm Anvati Singh, and you're listening to Three Things, the Indian Express news show. In this episode, we talk about Meghalaya government's plan to set up border outposts along the Assam border after the Mukro firing incident. We also talk about a new initiative in the United Kingdom to teach young children about the British colonial history. But first, we talk about the recently released GDP data. The Ministry of Statistics and Program Implementation released India's economic growth data for the second quarter of the current financial year. This includes data about the country's GDP, GVA, and overall health and growth of the economy. In this segment, Indian Express's Udit Misra joins us to explain the report. Alright, so Udit, can you first explain to us the concept of GDP?
Right. So GDP essentially means gross domestic product. And very simply put, it is the money value of all the goods and services that are produced in an economy over a particular period of time. So we can have GDP over a quarter, GDP over a year, and essentially that gives you a certain sense of what is the size of the economy. And when we talk about GDP growth, we are basically calculating it year on year. So when we say this is the GDP growth for the second quarter, the first quarter is April, May, June. The second quarter is July, August, and September. So when we say GDP of the second quarter grew by 6.3%, what we basically mean is that whatever was the total monetary value of goods and services produced in the second quarter last year, this year we have produced 6.3% more than that.
Right, so you said that Q2 or quarter 2 GDP rate was 6.3%. Could you tell us what this number means?
Right. So suppose the economy only made cars, then there'll be a monetary value to that car. Suppose the car is worth 1 lakh rupees. And if you suppose make whatever number of cars and that total value comes out to be, suppose, 100 times something rupees, a 6.3% growth in the second quarter means that if you made 100 monetary units of that car, 100 rupees of that car in the last quarter, in the second quarter of last year, you are making 106.3 monetary units of that car in the second quarter of this current financial year.
And Udit, how does this number reflect on the Indian economy?
Right. So, growth rates vary depending on the size of the economy. You typically would find that the bigger the economy, the growth rates are more muted. Why? Because those are bigger economies, and even when they grow in a substantial amount in absolute terms, because the base is huge as a percentage, that number comes out to be smaller. For smaller economies or growing economies, developing economies, what happens is that growth rates tend to be faster because they're growing faster, and also 100 rupees on the margin is a bigger percentage of the total in India than $100, say, in the US economy. So when we look at it, India is now the fifth largest economy. A 6.3% growth, if you see it in a global sense, is a fantastic growth rate. Very few economies would be able to match this kind of growth rate under the current circumstances, where you have wide swaths of developed world actually struggling to grow. You have US staring at recession, you have UK already in recession, you have Euro area already stalling, China is struggling to grow. So essentially, India is sort of one of those rare economies which is actually big enough in size and still growing at something like 6% or over that.
Okay, so this growth is good in a global sense. But can you talk about the domestic reality?
So for India's domestic realities, India has to grow much faster. A 6% growth is something that is not desirable. While it's nothing to be snide about, we typically, talk about trying to achieve double-digit growth rates, or at least, 7 or 8 or 9% growth rates. And we need to grow at that rate for a substantial period of time for India's poverty levels and consumption levels to improve. And that is why a 6% growth is often seen in a domestic sense to be a suboptimal number.
Right. And Udit, could you tell us about some of the key elements of GDP?
So there are 4 ways broadly in which money is spent. One is the money spent in our individual capacities that you and I spend when we buy a cup of coffee or a car for our personal use or a computer for our personal use or eat out. And that is all personal consumption. And this is called the private final consumption expenditure. And this is the biggest driver of India's GDP. 55% of India's GDP comes from this. Basically, 55% of all India's expenditure is in the manner of personal consumption expenditures. The second biggest engine of growth is the investment expenditure. It is when businesses make buildings, lay factories, buy computers for their employees, buy cars for travel or whatever, or a business class ticket for airfare and everything. That all comes under investments. Even the government, when it invests money to make a bridge or a road, that comes under investment expenditure. So expenditure which is not for personal consumption, but which is for creating assets that are productive assets, which will create further growth. So that is called investment expenditure. And that is the second biggest engine of growth. The third engine of growth is government expenditure. Government pays salaries and such, current consumption expenditure. That is the third engine. And the fourth is net exports. Basically, the net result of exports and imports. When we import, the money goes out of the country. When we export, the money comes into the country. So net exports. And in India's case, this net exports is typically negative because we import more than we export. And as a result, we typically have a negative sign in front of net exports in the equation. And you'll find that typically drags down the GDP overall. So those are the four broad parameters.
So the ministry also released GVA data. Can you tell us what is GVA and how it is different from the GDP?
So there are, both GVA, gross value added, and GDP, gross domestic product, are both measures of the same thing. It is about national income. So how do you decide the national income of an economy? You can either use GDP, and when we are calculating GDP, what we do is that we look at the expenditures made in the economy. We basically say that let's calculate who spent how much money. Suppose I sold you one sack of potatoes. You took that for 100 rupees, then you cut them, sliced them, and you sold it on forward to some other person for 200 rupees. And that person actually fried it and turned it into chips and then sold it in the market for, say, 500 rupees. Now, the final value is 500 rupees, and you calculate at each stage what is the intermediary value. You reduce that, and then total value added at each stage will be calculated, and you'll get a certain sense of how much is the addition of value across different sectors in the economy. And that also, essentially, that is your income. So you take GVA, which is the first variable, you add taxes that the government earns, and you remove subsidies that the government gives, and then you come to GDP. That's the basic link. And typically, since the government earns more taxes than it spends in subsidies, the GDP number is higher than GVA.
Well, now can you give us the key elements for GVA?
So GVA in basically, you have to carve out the economy into different sectors. You can carve it out in different ways. And you have basically, agriculture is one big sector, with forestry and fishing is one, mining, quarrying, manufacturing, electricity, construction, and these all can be clubbed together as sort of the industries sector. And then you have the services thing, and there are different kinds of services. There can be trade, hotels, tourism related services, financial services, banking services, and then a whole lot of other services, including, government services, public administration and stuff. And so there are different heads under which you can check the value addition.
Okay, and Udit, what can be the takeaways from the GDP data?
So I think, for quarterly data, it is better to look at GVA numbers because they tell you the sectoral health of the economy, which sector is doing well and which sector is not. And if you look at the GVA data, what you'll find is that agriculture is one area which has done well year on year, as against last year. It has grown by 4.6%, and that seems to be a very sort of surprising improvement because there were some concerns about the sowing of crops this year. And the other big story, possibly the biggest story in the GVA data this time, has been the contraction in manufacturing. Now, typically manufacturing is a sector which creates a lot of jobs, or at least has a potential to create a lot of jobs. It can soak up the excess labor that is there in India and bring it into manufacturing, create jobs. And that sector in the last quarter has actually contracted by 4.3%. And one of the ways to understand this is that when we look back at the data on what's been happening to manufacturing over the last 6 years, we find that manufacturing has actually remained muted. So while the 4.3 number might be because of some reasons post COVID or some amount of uncertainty because of the Ukraine war or whatever, over the last 6 years, actually, manufacturing has struggled. And that is where CMIE, Center for Monitoring Indian Economy data shows that manufacturing jobs have actually halved between 2016 and 2020. So that remains a big worry from the GVA data that comes out. And actually, there are a couple of other sectors which are also very huge in terms of employment potential, which are also struggling. One is, say, the mining and quarrying, which has contracted by 2.8%. And the other sector which creates a lot of jobs are, places like trade and hotel, transport, communication services. This has grown by almost 15% year on year. So if you just look at 1 year difference, you'll find that this is fantastic growth and it portends well for the future period. Maybe we'll continue to grow. But when we look at a difference between what it did this quarter as against what it was 3 years ago, the second quarter of FY20, which was the pre-COVID marker, we find that it has just grown by 2.1%. So which means that trade and hotels, this industry is just 2.1% above what it was in 2019, basically. And that is on the GVA side. On the GDP side, I think there are some surprising things and some salutary things. One is that, private consumption, which, as I said, is the biggest engine of India's growth, has grown by 9.7, roughly 10% over the last year, which is a good number. But when you look at the pre-COVID state, and if you say, okay, how far are we from the pre-COVID state, say, FY20, then the growth is only 11 odd percent. So which means while it can be happy about the fact that you grew by 10% over the last year, or you could be more realistic about the fact that since 2019-20, we have just grown by 11%. So basically, we're still over 3 years, we've just grown by 11%.
Next, we talk about the Meghalaya Assam border dispute. Almost a week after the Mukro firing, which resulted in 6 deaths, Meghalaya government has decided to set a border outpost at 7 quote-unquote sensitive locations, including Mukro. The villagers who live at these sensitive locations have demanded border outposts to prevent further transgressions. And now, this announcement meets the long-standing demands of the villagers. Indian Express's Debraj Deb joins us in this segment to explain the events of last week and what a border outpost or BOP means for the villagers. So Debraj, could you begin by talking about the firing incident that took place last week at Mukro?
So what really happened at Mukro on November 22nd morning has to be understood in the context of what happened on the night before, the intervening night between November 21st and 22nd, which is according to the villagers of Mukro, which is a small village in West Jaintia Hills district of Meghalaya. And it is very close to the Assam-Meghalaya interstate boundary, and it is almost 100 kilometers away from Shillong. And over there, what happened on the intervening night between November 21st and 22nd is that a team of Assam police personnel, they allegedly intercepted a vehicle of the village where 4 villagers were traveling late in the night around 1 o'clock or something like that, with a few bags of rice and some fodder. And a team of Assam police personnel allegedly came into the village, which is in Meghalaya, by the way. And 2 vehicles of Assam police and forest personnel allegedly stopped them. Of these 4 people in the car, 3 were yanked back and dragged back. Supposedly they were arrested and dragged back to a local forest outpost of Assam on the Assam side of the interstate boundary in the area. One of them managed to flee. Now, it was around 3 o'clock in the night when this thing happened. Around 6:37 in the morning, almost 3 vehicles strong team of Assam and police and forest personnel returned to the village. According to the villagers, they don't know why they returned, but they suspect they had come to arrest more men from the village. And this is particularly because the local villagers say that in the area, Assam has a forest camp or forest checkpost on its side, but Meghalaya has none. And for years, they allege that these kind of transgressions and incursions on the interstate boundary have been happening. Even earlier in January this year, a team of Assam police personnel were chasing a vehicle down the road. Supposedly the vehicle was of some smugglers, and Assam police personnel were basically firing from behind. And luckily, nobody got hurt in the incident. But in the Mukro incident, on November 22nd this year, some authorities, some officials came in the village. They were growled by some local villagers 7:30 in the morning. When they came for the second time, the villagers demanded that the Assam officials freed those 3 villagers whom they had arrested earlier. That's when the Assam authorities allegedly fired, and in the whole incident, 6 people, including one Assam forest personnel, forest guard, and 5 villagers from Mukro, they had died.
Okay, and this is the official version of both states or just Meghalaya?
Now, this is, of course, the Meghalaya side of the version, the Mukro side of the version. But, Assam police, immediately after the incident, the local SP of Assam, Imdad Ali, SP of Karbi Anglong district, who was later on transferred as part of the Assam government's steps taken to act on the incident. So the SP, who is no more the official in charge of the area now, but at that time, right after the incident, he had said that the Assam police had got a tip that there was going to be a vehicle coming in that area which would be carrying smuggled timber, and they were supposedly waiting for that vehicle. And when a truck, according to the Assam police, it was a truck, not a car, and when the truck came to the spot and the Assam authorities tried to stop it, the truck allegedly tried to speed over. It disregarded the forest and police barricade, and it tried to speed into Meghalaya by force, which is when the Assam authorities had to fire on it, puncturing one of its tires, and it somehow slumped a little bit inside what is now admitted as Meghalaya.
Right. And now, after the incident, Meghalaya decided to set up border outposts at sensitive locations. So, could you talk to us about these specific locations?
So I would like to point out two things here before I come to the point where the sensitive locations would be there, because it is contextual. Assam claimed that the spot where the incident happened was a part of Jirikinding police station in Karbi Anglong district of Assam, which basically meant that the area where the incident happened, the Mukro village, which is in Meghalaya, was initially claimed by Assam to be a part of Assam. Assam, I would like to mention here, is already undergoing talks with Meghalaya for solving a very long pending border dispute with Meghalaya in 12 locations of the state. And the first phase of talks, which were earlier held in August this year, it resolved to form local, regional committees to oversee these kind of issues. And 6 out of these 12 locations were already taken up for border dispute resolution earlier this year. The second round of talks were supposed to be held this week, in the last week of November. But just days before the second round of talks could begin, the Mukro incident happened. Later on, the government, as well as the Assam Chief Minister Himanta Biswa Sharma, clarified that the incident actually did happen. Clash was a local clash between Assam police and some villages of Meghalaya. So basically, the version that Assam initially tried to put out, that the incident happened inside Assam, was countered, was falsified by Assam Chief Minister himself. After the cabinet meeting held yesterday, Meghalaya Chief Minister Conrad Sangma announced that the state cabinet had approved the creation of border outposts in certain sensitive locations in Meghalaya across the boundary areas with Assam. These areas are Muriap in East Jayantia Hills, Mukro, our village which is under discussion, and Tievi in West Jayantia Hills, Rani Jirang in Ribhoi district, Umwali, Lejadubi, and Langpi in West Khasi Hills district. So many of these areas which have contested claims of territoriality are still not resolved, are still not put to rest. So naturally there is contradictory claims. Who owns which piece of land?
And Debraj, what is Meghalaya's plan of action for the near future?
Well, the Meghalaya government has been in the process of identifying some locations which are basically sensitive, where the government feels border outposts should be set up. And the 7 locations that I mentioned, there are Meghalaya police's border outposts or Meghalaya side security personnel's border outposts to be set up. And this would obviously be in consultation with the local communities. In some areas, like in Ribhoi district, where demands were there to set up, border checkposts, but proper areas could not be identified yet. The Meghalaya government is still in the process of consultation and discussion with the local communities and authorities to find out a proper suitable area where these border outposts can be set up. I would like to mention one thing here, that the border outpost issue was a very important point of demand, which I found when I visited Mukro earlier this week. And most of the villagers wanted that at least some sort of infrastructure should be put on the Meghalaya side of the interstate boundary, so that transgressions of boundary by Assam police cannot happen just to the drop of a hat at any point of time, which they say has become the norm of the situation in this part of the far-flung areas of Meghalaya. They say that this kind of transgressions are very common, in fact. Even they say that some of the officials of Assam police and Assam forest personnel have been charging illegal taxes from them, especially in the paddy harvesting season, when the villagers have to go to the community fields and do the agricultural activities there, and the community fields are very close to the interstate boundary, which is why the local villagers feel that unless border outpost is set up there, and in similar areas of all these parts of the state, if the border outposts are not set up, there would be a security crisis. And certainly this decision to set up border outposts has been taken well in the village.
Right. So the villagers have demanded these outposts for years. Now that the government has finally taken a decision on this, can you tell us how the villagers feel?
So they feel that the interstate boundary has a BOP on the Meghalaya side. They will be safer, they will be sound, and they will be secure. They feel that a BOP will give peace to the village after all these years. And of course, the most important factor here is that while government is providing compensation and other benefits to the bereaved families, the BOP on Meghalaya side is expected to put all this panic and trauma of villages like Mukro, who has been at the end, has been at the brunt of border dispute problems, and has not been really receiving the respite from either side, from Assam or Meghalaya or the central government. They feel the BOP will finally put their worries at rest.
And in the end, we talk about a group of South Asian educators in the United Kingdom who are developing a unique curriculum to teach young children about the British Empire and its connection with the partition. The educators, who are a part of the South Asian diaspora in the UK, formed a Partition Education Group for this purpose. They realized that for many South Asian origin students in the United Kingdom, the history of their country of origin is often a mystery and left out of history books. The Indian Express's Divya Goyal spoke to them about the project and how UK schools have responded to it. So, Divya, can you first talk to me about this Partition Education Group?
Yeah, so Partition Education Group is about a group of education professionals from United Kingdom, especially from London, who are working on a unique project called the Partition Curriculum. The group is basically a collection of teachers, teacher trainers and others working in education sector, and their aim is to include India-Pakistan partition history in the curriculum of UK schools, because according to them that is a part of British history which the children in Britain, they are not being taught about. So according to them, the history of India and Pakistan's partition is not just about them but equally about British, because it's a shared history and the children in UK need to know about it.
So, you spoke to many of the members of the group. Most of them were born and raised in the UK. What did they say about their experience in the British education system?
So, most of the teachers that I spoke to, their parents or grandparents had moved from Punjab, such as Sandeep Kaur. She's one of the teachers who has grown up in London, and her parents had moved from Kapurthala in Punjab. According to her, across her schooling in UK during her childhood, she was never taught about partition or South Asian history of the colonial history of the British in school. All that she learned about it was from the external sources, her family, internet, and that too very recently. She is in her 40s, but till her late 30s, she was not aware of what exactly happened during partition, the mass migration, the trauma, how Punjab was divided into two, how people were killed during the riots, displaced. So that's why she, along with other teachers, the group's founder, Raj Unsworth, she's also a teacher. So all of them have started this unique project, a Partition Education Group.
Right. So, Divya, they're working on a so-called partition curriculum. Could you tell us a little about what they have planned?
They are in the process of developing a curriculum which will be for primary as well as for the secondary classes. It will include several topics starting from East India Company, British rule in India, to partition, the upheaval of 1857, and then how the independence movement took shape, the independence struggle, famines, everything that happened pre and post independence. And also it will include not just the history of India, Pakistan, but also Bangladesh. This entire curriculum will be divided into lessons, and they will be sharing this curriculum with schools in UK, and they are in the process of contacting schools at their own level, because in UK schools have this power to take a decision at their own level that this will be a part of their syllabus or not.
Okay, so it is apparent from your conversations with the founders that there is a lack of understanding about South Asian history in British schools. But will these lessons be only for students of the South Asian diaspora?
No, it will be for all the children who study in UK schools, including the British children and the British Indians of Indian origin. It is not just about the children with Indian origin, because that is what the group aims to give a message, that the colonial history of British in South Asia is not just about India or Pakistan. It is equally about the British. There are several lessons which needs to be learned from that history. And that is why it is important for British children to know what their ancestors did in India and Pakistan, because the repercussions of it are still being felt today.
Right. But considering how the UK has its own, national curriculum that schools follow, could you tell us how the people are responding to their plan of teaching partition history to the students?
Yeah, so right now UK follows a national curriculum which is mandated by the government, but then the schools also have the autonomy to decide if they want to include some of the topics on their own. So right now the group is in the process of training teachers who will take it further ahead to their schools, and also they are in the process of talking to school principals, and according to the group members the response has been very positive, because they will be sticking to the facts in the entire curriculum. They will not be taking any sides that who was right, who was wrong. They will just stick to the facts that what happened then.
Well, Divya, at the root of it, why do the founders believe that a curriculum like this is needed today?
According to these teachers, there are many Indians and the people from Pakistan origin who still face racism in UK. That is what their group founder said, that listen, we are here because you were there in our country. You displaced us from our country, and that's why we had to come to UK. So it's all interconnected. And today, if British children will learn about what their ancestors did and how the partition happened, maybe their behavior and their attitude towards Indians who are living in UK, it will change. There will be less of racism.
You were listening to Three Things by the Indian Express. Today's show was hosted by me, Anviti Singh, and written and produced by me and Rahul Philippos with the help of Utsha Sarman. It was edited and mixed by Suresh Pawar. If you like the show, then do subscribe to us wherever you get your podcasts. You can also recommend the show to someone who you think will like it, share it with a friend or someone in your family. It's the best way for people to get to know about us. You can also tweet us at Express Podcast and write to us at podcast@indianexpress.com.